Although he spent his whole life, from birth to retirement, in the cities of Amsterdam and then Groningen, his life was far from ordinary. Incredibly intelligent and gifted, having the rare combination of simultaneously being a fine theoretician and skilled experimentalist, Frits Zernike started his scientific journey in astronomy and then applied his findings in microscopy. Before his discovery was recognized and awarded the Nobel Prize, the Nazis were the first to see the potential in Zernike's achievement. This is the story of the man that made it possible to see what couldn't be seen before. Hello, curious cats, and welcome to the 7th episode of Choosing.Science. Today we'll be talking about the man that helped us see through the microscope in a way that couldn't be seen before, and who had to fight for his great invention almost 23 years until he finally got his well-deserved Nobel Prize. He was born on July 16th, 1888, and was the third child out of 6 in a highly educated family. Both parents were math teachers, while 3 of his sisters distinguished themselves in particular. So one of them was one of the most prominent poets in the country. She was called Elizabeth Zernike. Another sister, Anna Zernike, became the first woman ordained in the Dutch Mennonite Church, and the third died 8 days before she turned 100 years old, which I oddly count as an achievement because that must be so infuriating. But speaking of, I found out that 4 out of the 6 siblings died in March, including Frits, which I guess in a very morbid way, it practically made death anniversaries quite convenient. Yeah, I felt like I should have just put it out there as a very odd coincidence, but yeah. But the thing about him, besides this weird coincidence in his family, is that he didn't just take after his parents. He was very dedicated to his craft and ideas from an early age, and bought tubes, pots, and all sorts of other materials from his own pocket money or through some gifts he received just to explore his ideas. And that really made me think, and I would like to point out how important that is to explore your interest, to be curious and test your ideas. I find that many times this innate curiosity that most of us possess is stripped away in school or while we are growing up, and some of us turn very cynical. So what is something you were always wondering and never got to test it out? And no, letting a radioactive spider bite you will not turn you into Spider-Man? I tried that and failed, so you're free to try anything else. You're welcome. In his scientific adventure, it sort of started, let's say, when he got into university in 1908, where he chose to major in chemistry and minor in physics and maths, so basically in almost everything. What was interesting is that in 1908, while he was a chemistry student in Amsterdam, he won a competition held by the University of Groningen with an article on probability theory based on a party game called the Bell and Hammer game. The university published Zernike's article, which was written in French out of all of the languages possible, not sure why, but it would also spanned 34 very densely written pages. In it, he described the game's components, including cards, dice, and counters, and explained the various chances of winning through extensive calculations and mathematical transformations. which sounds cool, but I have a feeling that he was not fun at parties. But who am I to judge? He received his prize for this article, a medal from the University Senate, on August 16th, 1908, during the opening of the academic year. His research during his bachelor's and master also won him a medal, a gold medal, from the Dutch Society of Science in 1912. A year later, on a fateful day, he met Jacobus Kaptein, who was not the captain, a bit of a false advertisement, but he was something related to that. He was an astronomer, and he introduced Zernike to astronomy. A little fun fact about Jacobus: he was one in 14 children. More remarkable about him is the fact that he was the first one to show that the stars move into opposite streams, which later served as proof that the Milky Way is perpetually rotating and moving through space. He supervised the cataloging of more than 450,000 southern stars and applied statistics to determine the architecture of that part of the galaxy. The amount of work and dedication is honestly astonishing to think about, especially in those times with no computers, and Zernike got a chance to do his studies under him, which was very fortunate. While Zernike had some valuable discoveries during this time and when he was an associate professor later on, for example, a new type of galvanometer, or when he wrote integral equations theory for equilibrium for fluids and so on. The invention he is most known for is the phase contrast technique in microscopy, for which he also received a Nobel Prize later on. Initially, he encountered an issue while using the telescope, but later recognized the fact that in microscopy at that time they had the same problem, and he very elegantly solved it with the phase contrast technique. So telescopes and microscopes employ mirrors, which at that time sometimes produced ghost images, and Zernike hypothesized that they were caused by out-of-phase wavelengths. If he could somehow bring the direct and diffracted images back into phase, perhaps this aberration, these ghost images, would disappear. But let's dive in on what exactly is this phase contrast technique. So, science time. The phase contrast is a technique used in microscopy to enhance the contrast of transparent specimens, such as cells, for example. Normally, these transparent specimens are very difficult to see under a microscope because they do not absorb or scatter light strongly enough to create a visible contrast. So, the phase of light refers to the position of the light wave at a particular point in time. Specifically, it refers to the relationship between the peaks and throughs of the light wave. That's why it's a wave, because it oscillates, and how they align with respect to a reference point. In a simple wave, so just think about one simple wave. The phase is determined by the position of the wave relative to this maximum amplitude or highest peak of the wave. When two waves are combined, their phases can add up or cancel each other depending on their alignment. In the context of phase contrast microscopy, the phase of light passing through a transparent specimen is altered by a special faceplate, causing a shift in the alignment of the light waves passing through different parts of the specimen. This faceplate was invented by Zernike. And this shift of these different wavelengths creates a visible contrast in the resulting image, making it possible to observe the otherwise transparent specimen. The faceplate produces two beams of light, one that passes through the specimen and another that bypasses it. When these two beams are recombined, they interfere with each other and create a distinctive pattern of bright and dark areas that correspond to the different phases of the light passing through the specimen. This creates a high contrast image of the transparent specimen, making it much easier to see and study. And the best thing about it was that the specimens could be kept alive and studied, because more in-depth analysis meant killing and staining them before this technique was invented. They could finally observe living cells and microorganisms at a detail never before encountered while keeping them alive. So, sounds really cool, right? Not so much for the community at the time, which met the invention with crickets. Although Zernike discovered it in 1913, he will receive his Nobel Prize for it only in 1953. He actively made efforts to popularize his invention and tried to bring its benefits to the attention of the scientific community. He even went to the Zeiss company, which is one of the oldest and still leading company in optical instruments. But their reaction to Zernike's invention was unexpectedly cold. So cold, in fact, that Zernike felt the need to mention it in his Nobel Prize speech. And I quote, "With the phase contrast method still in the first, somewhat primitive stage, I went in 1932 to the Zeiss works in Jena to demonstrate. It was not received with such enthusiasm as I expected. Worst of all was one of the oldest scientific associates who said, 'If this had any practical value, we would ourselves have invented it long ago.'" Long ago indeed. The great achievements of the firm in practical and theoretical microscopy were all due to their famous leader Ernst Abbe and dated from before 1890, the year in which Abbe became sole proprietor of the Zeiss works. From then on, he had been absorbed in administrative and social problems, partly also in other fields of optics. Indeed, his last work on microscopy dates from that same year. In it, he gave a simple reason for certain difficulties with transparent objects, but this was of no account. His increasing staff of scientific collaborators, evidently under the impression of his inspiring personality, formed the tradition that everything worth knowing or trying in microscopy had been achieved already. For more than 25 years after Abbe's death in 1906, his great authority thus barred the way to further progress. Here is one more remarkable historic point. Whereas all the other achievements of Abbe's were greatly appreciated by all practical microscope users, his theory of image formation was firmly rejected by most of them. To the physicist, this may seem incredible, especially when he remembers Abbe's experiments, which in his opinion confirmed the theory in a convincing way. The opposing microscopists, however, said these experiments only showed how the microscope may be used, or rather misused, by the physicist for interference experiments which have nothing to do with the ordinary proper use of the instrument. A long story could be told about the violent controversies of this kind which occurred time and again through half a century. We can say now that Abe and his followers were as much to blame as the other party. For one thing, their theory was too abstract. It only applied to the oversimplified cases of a point source of light and an object of regular structure. However, it could be very well have been extended to meet the practical cases. But then it was also incomplete, and it did not explain the peculiarities in the imaging of transparent objects. And what is worse, its defenders never recognized this incompleteness. Small wonder, therefore, that the microscopists rejected the theory as useless in practice. End quote. So, we have to appreciate the subtlety with which Zernike roasted the people at Zeiss with maybe too many words, but he basically do that. And I would probably be just as petty in my Nobel Prize speech if I have to wait so long for my invention to be recognized for what it was. So what he did was to tell them, and pardon my French, that they couldn't tell their ass from a hole in the ground. In a very eloquently justified his stance. And ironically, to all of this, to add insult to injury, I guess, is that the Nazis, or more specifically the Wehrmacht, had less of an ego and recognized the phased contrast as for what it was, revolutionary. Although it is not documented if it was actually used for their agenda, I couldn't find much. They did seize the technical details in an attempt to gain an advantage in the war and started the mass production of these microscopes. Regardless, after World War II ended, the new microscopes kept being mass-produced by Zeiss and other companies. Zernike said about this, quote, Zeiss in Jena, who had started with so little enthusiasm, slowly continued with the method. After some more of my visits, after some years of developing two complicated instruments, and after further delay by the war, they bought out phase contrast objectives and accessories in 1941. End quote. I guess one only realizes what they had after a bunch of genocidal nationalists took it away from them. I would not recommend using this tactic to gain recognition though, but what do I know? Side note, time for the question of the episode. What other technological advancements were seized by the Nazis, by the Wehrmacht? And yes, there were a lot of them. Well, some of them surprising, some not so much. So go do your little research. Okay, back to Zernike. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much about him as a person. When looking for his obituary, I actually stumbled across his son's obituary, only because he had the exact same name and was also a physicist. I do harbor the suspicion that Zernike, the father, was actually able to clone himself, but at this moment is only a speculation. Frits Jr. was also prominent in his field and had a son called the same, but at least he had the decency to mention that he was the third Frits in line. But maybe he mentioned that he's the third one because the grandson owns an ice cream company in the US and wanted to make sure people knew that he is not part of the original clone, but apparently does physics very well. so the plot thickens. Now, on a more serious note, I will instead share some really interesting details about him and some small anecdotes. So, small fact about Zernike is that there is a lunar crater named after him, which is 48 kilometers in diameter. Pretty cool. I would like that. That would be really cool. Also, he is the great uncle of another physics Nobel laureate. I'm not sure why I am surprised. His name was Gerardus et Hooft and won his Nobel in 1999. And on the 100th anniversary of Zernike's birth in 1988, his son Frits Jr., I guess the original clone, and his granddaughter had intended to donate his original gold Nobel Prize medal to the University Museum in Groningen. However, though, when they arrived in the Netherlands from England, where they were residing, the medal was missing from their luggage. The family believed that the medal had been stolen while in transit, and to compensate, the museum received a gold-plated replica of the medal featuring Zernike's image. Some years later, after Frits Jr.'s passing in 2011, his family discovered the original medal tucked away in the suitcase lining. Today, it is kept securely in a safe, maybe to prevent this ever happening, I guess. So, those times you forget money in your winter trousers and give yourself a surprise the next year, but with very valuable metal. And another interesting anecdote about him, he was always experimenting. And according to the biography on the Groningen University's website, he was also a little menace to his colleagues' materials. Apparently, he often needed resources for his craft and new projects, and reportedly believed that the paperclip was the most important tool for any experiment. If I knew, probably now I would have a Nobel Prize too. He also had a habit of searching through his colleagues' offices for useful parts, and this became a concern for his colleagues, who were warned to lock their offices and not leave Zernike alone in the lab at night. However, a friendly porter who left a small cellar window open allowed Zernike to continue his scavenging. I can imagine his colleagues frantically hiding their office supplies to save them from this mad scientist. Who knows? Maybe he would have won another Nobel Prize, and now look what their colleagues did. But sometimes his mad skills came in handy. One time, but this happened outside of the laboratory apparently. On one occasion, he was stuck in a lift in Paris with several others, and upon seeing the manufacturer's data on the lift's type plate, he was able to recall the necessary technical specifications to fix it. After a few minutes of work, he got the lift running again. Unfortunately, it is not known whether he used a paper clip for his repair or not. But kudos to him. That was actually amazing. Maybe he should have been a spy rather than a scientist. It would most likely be paid better too. So, but despite winning countless awards, having prizes in his name, Nobel, patents, and overall bringing great value to the scientific community and the world in in general, Frits Zernike's grave is unmarked, which I think was a personal choice made out of his genuine modesty. I guess, the conclusion for this episode is to invent something amazing and wait for a totalitarian regime to popularize it. Maybe you'll be lucky. I mean, some people play the lottery and win, so who knows. But for the serious conclusion now, I think we can all learn a good lesson from Zernike as a scientist and as a person. Obviously, he was a scientific celebrity at one point, especially after winning the Nobel. But he seemed very humble and unassuming. He was also very serious, and apparently he did not take part in all the practical jokes that were happening in the physics department, and just kept his mind in the game and did his experiments and crafts and so on. But he invented and revolutionized out of his own passion, and not only left the world a valuable legacy and gave a tool that also revolutionized other fields such as cancer, for example. Finally, cancer cells could be seen in detail under the microscope, alive, which was extremely valuable. Also, his successors, such as his son, who continued the good work and was also regarded as an inspirational man and colleague. That was also, I guess, in a sense, Zernike's work and achievement to leave some good people behind. So I think in a way we should all be great people, or try to be. Strive to support and encourage others to be also great people. So let's plant the good seed around us and watch it propagate like Zernike did. He dabbled around in everything from maths to physics to chemistry. He left something behind from all of it, and that was probably just his innate curiosity. So I think a second takeaway from this episode is to never give up on what you're interested in. Yes, he made a career out of it, but it doesn't really matter in the end, as long as it keeps the spirit alive in you. It's one of the greatest things someone can do for themselves. This is what it means to be human, to be curious, to be passionate about something, to have this amazement about anything. These small moments when you look at what you did and you're like, wow, this is actually amazing. Even they might be sparse, these moments mean a lot, and it's what makes us human. Also, don't forget that good people can also be very petty sometimes, because sometimes that's just, it's good for the soul, it cleanses the soul. If he had the balls to be petty in a Nobel speech, I think we can be sometimes too. So, with that, thank you for listening. I hope you found this story about Frits Zernike interesting. And if you have any feedback and so on, I left my email down. I would really appreciate to see if you liked my work and it made you motivated in a way, or you took something interesting from it. So, until next time, stay curious.